Okay, next we're going to have Peter Jones. Peter, he runs the Lustre engineering team at Intel. He's been working on the Lustre project for over a decade. He's worked at CFS, Sun, Oracle, Wham Cloud, Intel. Wow. Makes me feel kind of old. Ladies and gentlemen, Peter Jones with a community release update.
Hi, everyone. So I've got quite a lot of material here to get through, so some of this I'll go through fairly quickly, and I'll dwell a bit more, I think it's warranted. So I'm one of the leads of the OpenSFS Lustre Working Group, along with Dustin Leverman of Oak Ridge, and this is a forum where we cover, anything relating to the community releases. It's been going on for a number of years, and we always welcome anyone who wants to attend. We have meet every other week, but for those of you who haven't got time, if you go to this link, there's very detailed minutes kept, and so you can keep up to date on the mailing lists. One of the activities we are involved in is the annual OpenSFS survey. So we've been doing this for 6 years now. So this year we had, last year we had exceptionally high response rates, so it was slightly down, but well within the usual range of what we see this year, and it's definitely, still valid for comparison purposes. Looking at the, this is just giving you some highlights of it. There is on the link I had on the last thing, last slide, there's a more detailed analysis, but just to give you some of the highlights of the survey this year, the Lustre versions, the blue on the graph on the blue bar on the left is last year's data, and the red on the right is this year's data. So you can see how we're seeing things shift over time. These are the percentage numbers. So you can see that still the 2.5 release is the most dominant release, as you'd expect. It's been well used for a number of years. A lot of vendors adopted that. But we do see strong adoption of the newer releases. At the time the survey was run last year, Lustre 2.8 and 2.9 weren't actually released yet, and we did still have a few people using 2.8 prior to its release. Going on to the Linux distribution, so on this case, the red is clients and the blue is servers. So you can see that, definitely Red Hat 6 is the most commonly used distribution by some margin, but Red Hat 7 is gaining ground compared to what we saw last year. Network-wise, still, great diversity of networks used. Mellanox and 10 Gigi are the most commonly used options. And one of the things we always ask about is the newer features. We know people are using these newer releases, but are they actually using the features in the newer releases? So comparing to what we saw last year, the most notable shifts were in, so in this one, the upper red bar is plans to use the feature in the coming year, and the lower blue bar is the actually using in production today. So, the most noticeable comparing to last year's data was that there was much higher usage of both DNE and LFSCK in production. And so that's, consistent with what we saw on the earlier slide about using the newer versions where those options become available. And I do want to say here, this question doesn't differentiate with DNE, whether it's DNE phase 1 or phase 2. So if, DNE phase 1 was remote directories, that's been around for a number of years. It came out in the Community 2.4 release. So, most people running versions in production today would have access to that. Whereas DNE phase 2 actually completed in the 2.8 release. And so, there are a number of sites using those releases, but not necessarily with DNE phase 2, which is Stripe directories. So if anyone here today is using Stripe directories in production, I'd very much like to chat with you. Please come and say hi on a break. I'd like to hear about your experiences there. This question about support. So the larger section, this is just showing where, how people, what kind of relationship they have with a support vendor, if they are a support vendor, or if they work with a vendor, or if they just, self-support using the mailing lists or whatever. So, we definitely see of people responding to this survey, about half of the respondents just self-support, which is really what makes this survey interesting to me, because we always have access through, support channels of customers, paying customers and what their requirements are and their usages. But this is a data point we have that includes the feedback from people who are just using Lustre as a, purely open source software, and, make sure that their requirements are being included when we're making decisions. So I do encourage you all to, when that survey comes out, it only takes a few minutes to answer, to take the time to do that. It really does help us with, making prioritization decisions and such like. So just to a bit of a recap over Lustre 2.9. So this release came out towards the end of last year, and had features from our hosts, Indiana University, DDN, Livermore, and Intel. It also, Red Hat 7.3 came out just in the right time, so we took the extra couple of weeks to make sure we were able to include that, and which I think has allowed us to have a longer shelf life on 2.9. Looking at the contribution stats, for those, probably seen data like this before, but this is both different views onto the same data. This is analysis data from Dustin Leatherman brokerage, based on the Git commits from the the Lustre tree repository, and the two views are, the left-hand one is the number of commits, so each individual change, and the right-hand one is the lines of code changed, summarized. So, we can see here, if you look at the two comparisons, it's fairly similar in most regards, but with Seagate, there's a proportionately larger amount of number of commits compared to lines of code changed. And this is, just part of the process we've been going through Seagate, as part of our partnership, and then moving to a more current release. They're just sort of clearing the cache, so to speak, with a number of just, smaller changes, but just, getting caught up with that kind of exercise. And then the converse is true with Indiana University, that, a relatively smaller number of commits, but much larger proportion of lines of code change, because this was all the work on the shared secure key feature, which of course was a lot more involved, a lot more lines of code. And then I also wanted to point out ANU having sort of a number of changes that were accepted for this release, and that's Dongyang Lee there, who has put forward a number of useful bug fixes in the course of that release, and they're not a name that we've seen previously before, so always glad to see the development community expanding like that. So the actual code changes themselves are not the only part of putting these releases together. Some pretty terrible formatting. That we also, as part of our process, have, in addition to the testing, have peer review of the each proposed code change, and we might go through multiple iterations before we actually settle upon the final version that lands for the code. So this is again showing all the levels of involvement from various entities in that area. And moving on to our current release, so 2.10. So this is a release that's targeted for the end of next month. This is the last day I can say that, because we're the most noticeable thing, change about this, as Brian was just talking about. We are planning to have freely available maintenance releases with this release. So I'm still looking at where we were trending this morning for I came down to breakfast. I still think we're looking pretty on track to come out there or thereabouts on time for our target, certainly within an error bar of the date. And then I would expect us to have a 2.10.1 and 2.10.2 probably before the end of the year. So just to set expectations there. In terms of the features, this is if you go to the 210 release page that we maintain in the LWG, these are the features you'll see listed there. All of these are in the release. My sort of pick of the features really are the progressive file layouts. So this is a collaboration we've had with Oak Ridge National Lab, and this allows striping policies to be set on the size of the file. They don't have to be specified up front. This takes things, allows you to put some adaptive settings that you're not relying on the user to make the right choices for their workloads. So this I think many administrators breathe a sigh of relief when they hear this is coming. And this is also foundational work, and Andreas will be talking tomorrow about some of the developments that follow on from this work. So this was interesting, and also multi-rail LNet has been much talked about and designed for a long time. This has been a collaboration with first. Oh dear, the formatting's a bit different on this slide deck than when I sent it off, but it's cutting off unfortunately. But it's a collaboration with. We started off with SGI and now with HPE working on this feature. Amir Shahata will be talking a bit more fully about this development and the follow-on development that builds on this work in his presentation tomorrow. But at a high level, this allows the usage of LNet across multiple interfaces and has benefits in terms of the performance and reliability. And with both these features and things that there has been a bit of a process change. We've learned from experience with some of the larger features, particularly D&E, which did drag on over multiple releases before we were able to officially have the whole thing there. That these were both developed in separate sandboxes, and we were able to do all of the reviews and the testing and sign off and be comfortable that we had everything working completely before it was integrated in one go. So that was a big shift in our development practices, and I think a very positive one, because if these large features hadn't been ready to land, it wouldn't have we wouldn't have had them sort of halfway working in a release and be trying to close on a release like we are now. So I think this will really help us with the overall quality and timeliness of the releases in the future. But while those are all the headline tasks, there's a number of very interesting other developments that I wanted to, in 210, that I wanted to draw your attention to. So Brian did talk a little bit about the ZFS metadata performance improvements, and this has been there's been changes that are required here, both on the Lustre side and in the ZFS itself. So Alex Zurolev gave a presentation about his involvement in this work at LUG last year, which had some data there. This completes, in 210, completes all of those Lustre changes, and there are corresponding changes in ZFS itself that are in the ZFS 0.7 release that will be, you'll need to have that in place to fully realize the benefits of those changes. But even without that ZFS change, there's still very noticeable improvements in this area already. And talking to Brian Behlendorf yesterday at the Developer Day, it sounds like we're very close to a ZFS 0.7 release. So perhaps it's even possible that we will still be able to include that in the final 2.10.0 release. If not, we'll certainly, as soon as it's ready and available, we will include it in a maintenance release. There's also improvements relating to Omnipath, the Intel fabric, that basically some changes in LNet that allow us to get more consistent and higher performance from Omnipath. So that would be interesting for people who have that. Also, we had some of our field engineers contributed the scripts that evolved over time from doing Lustre deployments for HA. So those are now in the Lustre tree for anyone who wants to use on those. And the hope is that perhaps these could become, instead of everyone reinventing the wheel in this area, that we sort of have some standardization and people can feedback their experience, improve those, rather than everyone having to write their own scripts. Also, we have got completely caught up with all our upstreaming efforts. The last feature to upstream was the ZFS snapshots. That's one of the features that was in 2.10, and we've flushed our cache in terms of bug fixes that had been found and with Enterprise Edition customers and fixed there first, and then upstreamed afterwards. We're all caught up. So if somebody is running an E3X release today, they would be able to upgrade to the 2.10 release if they felt so inclined. Other areas where there's been a lot of development during the 2.10 cycle, but it doesn't look like it's going to completely tie up during ahead of the release. There's patchless servers. We're very close to actually having that for LDiskFS. Just one last patch we're struggling with, and so as soon as we're able to close out on that, we will take full advantage of that, even with a maintenance release. 4.9 kernel support, we're just 2 patches away from getting there, and talking to James yesterday, it seems like there's only 3 more patches beyond that to get completely up to date with the latest kernel. Single thread performance, so Dimitri Araman will be talking about that tomorrow in more detail, but basically this gives you read and write performance benefits when you're running with single thread applications, and that the framework for that and the write work has landed, but it seems like the read work needs a little more time, and so maybe we'll just be in a subsequent maintenance release. And then, as Brian was alluding to, having less releases that we're coping with, that gives us frees up some time to be able to expand what we're taking on in terms of Linux distribution support. So initially, we think we're going to be able to introduce SLES server support and Ubuntu client support is the first things we're looking at there. So we're pretty close to having that, and we probably would be able to announce that with one of our maintenance releases. And then MoFed 4 support. So, as you saw earlier, a lot of people use Mellanox, and Mellanox generally encourages people to move to the latest releases quite aggressively. So we routinely would usually have support for this in fairly short order, and it's not really worthy of note because it's just taken for granted. But I did want to flag this because Mellanox did make some changes in the way things worked under the hood there, which has been quite disruptive from a Lustre point of view, and we're making the necessary adjustments to be able to work as quickly as we can. Doesn't look, unfortunately, like it's going to be ready for 2.10, but certainly, in a subsequent maintenance release, it should be already. 2.10 contribution stats. This is fairly up-to-date data. This was just from last week. But so the final versions will be a bit higher than this, but as we're kind of coming to the closing stages of the release, and we definitely wind down the number of landings as we get closer to the release, this is probably gives a fairly good sense of how things are shaping up. The only usual suspects here really, but just to call out the University of Hamburg, who did have some changes accepted, which was always nice to see some new names getting involved. And then on the reviews page, oh god, this really was okay when I said it. Okay. The Stanford University is a new name here in the review section, so just to give them some acknowledgement. And then just to see how 2.10 compares to its predecessors. So it's looking at the moment, like we're trending to see something that's sort of fairly middle ranking in terms of the amount of change in this release. Still seeing fairly healthy numbers of developers, compared to sort of historic numbers. It's good to see that we have a larger development community than we did going back some years, which obviously is one of the things we've been really working on, and why we had things like the Developer Day and the Hackathon yesterday. We're always looking to expand the number of people involved in Lustre development. Going beyond to 11, I'm not going to steal Andreas' thunder by going into any detail here, but just to say that, really to highlight these URLs. So The lower one, the roadmap on lustre.org, is where the graphical version of the roadmap is, that very commonly is what's shown. But I did want to highlight the projects URL, which is a wiki table, but is a more comprehensive list of all the development going on in the community. And so we encourage anyone who's working on anything in the Lustre realm to sort of register what they're working on there to try and avoid, to create the opportunity for collaboration and to avoid limit the risk of having conflicts of people working in the same area, perhaps at odds with each other. And so, yeah, this is the same graphic that Brian showed, but just to sort of, rather than talk to specifics on it, just to explain how we handle this. So we do updates in this in the LWG, and our practice is that we just give a high-level view of where the releases are trending, and maybe a major feature or two that we expect to be in the release. And then we quite consciously keep the details light, and then we get more specific as we are able to be more accurate. And so what we're trying to avoid, we know there's a lot of variables and moving parts here. We try and avoid creating expectations around a certain thing in a certain timeline, and then people make plans around that are then disrupted. And so, an example of us being conservative, progressive file layouts were originally showed up on a previous version of this graphic as being in 2.11, and they're actually in 2.10. And that was, we knew it was a kind of on the cusp as to which way it would fall, and we erred on the side of conservatism. So, this gives you a rough idea, and just to show that it is a live active project. But if there's something you're particularly involved in, a certain feature, it definitely makes sense to have a conversation about and get things, straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. And then I did want to talk a little more about, we're throwing this terminology LTS around, long-term stable releases. It's not a unique concept in software development. Many other projects have this kind of idea. Really, this is very similar to what we were doing back in the WAM Cloud days, where we had, a designated maintenance release stream, which we would announce ahead of time. We're going to have a release every quarter for the next, 18 months, that kind of thing. And so, basically, I think the lesson we learned from that was that announcing things firmly that far ahead didn't always serve us well, and we'd really like to use our resources where they're needed. So there might be times where we need to do, a couple of releases in a quarter, and other times where there's no great reason to do one. So we will, to allow people to plan around it, we will say that it will be at least 18 months, quite probably a bit longer, possibly a little bit longer, that we will be producing releases and keeping up to date. So if there's important bug fixes, we'll, early on I expect there'll be a number of things that are going to come to light when people start using this with a variety of workloads in production. So we'll have, important bug fixes to cover. But there's always things just to keep the software relevant in terms of, supporting the new Red Hat version or Mellanox version or whatever else it is. And we'll make sure that we have, regular enough updates to keep the latest version of the software to be the version that people need. And also, we're not, back in the WAM Cloud era, we used to, not produce any maintenance releases for anything that wasn't our designated maintenance release stream. And I think that we will, what we'll do now is to, we will be open to that. So, but it will just depend on demand and what makes sense to do. So, for example, if we look in the very near future, 2.11 is expected to have data on MDT. So, that's a feature a lot of people are interested in. So maybe there'll be fairly strong adoption of that. And there might be reason to do a 2.11.1, but if we get to the stage by which a 2.12 comes out, at that point we probably would, we would stop doing 2.11 maintenance releases, and we would encourage people to use 2.12 for, or a maintenance release of 2.12 going forward. So in that way, we're just sort of helping set expectations so that people can plan accordingly, and and using our community resources, sensibly, because we really don't want to spread ourselves too thinly. And then I want to give a bit of a plug for documentation. So this was one of the things we did at a hackathon yesterday, was people sat around fixing errors in the manual, deleting irrelevant, out-of-date stuff, things like that. So, not everyone has time or inclination to do that, but if you do spot an accuracy in the manual, please just open a ticket so that we're aware, and even if you aren't the one to fix it, that somebody knows that it's a problem and goes to look at it, because that's the thing is, the most expert people don't necessarily read the manual because they know how to do things, but then the reading the manual is a newbie coming to Lustre, that's the first thing they do. And we don't want their experience to be a negative one, finding stale, inaccurate content. And then, just to summarize, 2.10 is looking on track and should be out soon. There will be freely available maintenance releases on 2.10. And there's no shortage of options for anyone interested in helping with Lustre, either through the LWG or in other ways. And so if you are interested in that, please come chat to me and see what, make the necessary introductions or whatever to get you set up. So I think that's all my slides. So if anyone has questions, happy to take questions now, or please, come and say hi on a break and we'll talk then.
Questions, raise your hand, we'll run the microphone to you.
We're about 15 minutes ahead of schedule, so we have lots of time for questions. Are you all awake? Are you awake in the back there? No? They're like, no, we're not awake.
Peter, this is the follow-up from the Brian question. So the cloud edition, will that be open source?
Well, the cloud edition just runs, a regular Lustre release. You mean the scripts that deploy it?
Yes.
It's possible. We haven't started that process, but that's possible. We might do that. As Brian said, Cloud Edition, we're looking at a broader cloud strategy, and so I don't know the outcome of that yet.
Okay.
Okay, well, seems like everyone's either shy or I've covered everything. Okay.